If you could hover above West Africa today and look down from the sky, you would see something strange. You would see dozens of sovereign nations, different flags, different presidents, different parliaments, different armies. But if you followed the flow of money instead of borders, you would see something far less free. You would see a hidden system, invisible to most people, quietly binding the economies of 14 African countries to a single foreign power. There are no soldiers stationed in their capitals, no colonial governor sitting in a palace, no empire openly claiming ownership. Yet behind the scenes, one country still decides how much money they can print, how much they can borrow, how their currency moves, and, most importantly, who truly benefits from their wealth. This is the story of modern financial control disguised as cooperation. It is the story of how independence can be granted on paper, while economic sovereignty is quietly taken away. It is the story of how an entire region of Africa was freed from colonial rule, but not from colonial money. This is the story of the CFA Franc. To understand how this system came to exist, we must go back to 1945, at the end of World War II. Europe lay in ruins. France, once a global empire, was economically exhausted, politically fragile, and desperately trying to hold on to what remained of its colonies. Across Africa, independence movements were growing stronger. Soldiers who had fought for France in the war were returning home demanding freedom. Protesters filled the streets. Writers, teachers, and political leaders were speaking openly about self-rule. The French government knew one thing clearly: full political control over Africa would not last much longer. But they also understood something far more subtle. If you lose political power, you can still maintain economic power. So instead of preparing to fully let go, France designed a new kind of empire, not one ruled with guns, but one ruled with money. In 1945, France created a new currency for its African colonies, the CFA Franc. Officially, CFA originally stood for Colonies Françaises, different French colonies of Africa. Later, when independence came, it was rebranded as Communauté Financière Africaine, but the reality behind it never truly changed. On the surface, this currency was presented as a stabilizing tool. France promised that it would protect African economies from inflation, provide international credibility, and make trade easier. Too many African leaders at the time, exhausted from war and political struggle, this sounded like a reasonable compromise. But hidden inside this agreement were terms that would bind Africa's money to France for generations. Here is how the system actually works. 14 African countries, mostly former French colonies in West and Central Africa, use the CFA franc today. These countries include Senegal, Ivory Coast, Mali, Burkina Faso, Benin, Togo, Niger, Cameroon, Gabon, Chad, and others. These nations are officially independent. They have presidents. They have elections. They have national flags. But their currency is not fully theirs. Their money is printed in France. Their monetary policy is heavily influenced by France. And, most shockingly, a large portion of their national reserves must be stored in the French treasury. Under the original rules of the CFA system, African countries were required to deposit 65% of their foreign currency reserves in the special account at the French Central Bank in Paris. This means, when these countries export gold, cocoa, oil, or cotton, and earn foreign currency like dollars or euros, most of that money does not stay in Africa. It sits in France. Imagine this. A farmer in Ivory Coast grows cocoa. It is sold internationally. The country earns money from that export, but instead of using all that money to build schools, hospitals, or roads in Ivory Coast, a majority of it is held in a French bank. Africa earns. France holds. In return, France guarantees the value of the CFA franc. It is pegged to the euro, meaning its exchange rate is fixed. On paper, this provides stability. But in reality, it comes at a devastating cost. Because the value of the currency is controlled externally, African countries cannot freely adjust their money supply to match their own economic needs. If a country like Senegal wants to print more money to fund infrastructure or development, it cannot do so independently. It must align with French monetary policy. If a country wants to devalue its currency to make its exports cheaper and more competitive, it cannot do so freely. France must approve. In other words, they are independent nations with a controlled currency. Critics have called this system modern economic colonialism, because while African countries technically own their resources, gold, oil, cocoa, timber, they do not fully control the money generated from them. And here is where the story gets even darker, because this is not just about banking rules, it is about political power. For decades, France maintained close political ties with its former African colonies through a network known as Francafrique. This was a shadow system of influence involving military interventions, political manipulation, business deals, intelligence operations, and financial pressure through the CFA Franc. If an African leader tried to challenge French interests, perhaps by nationalizing resources, questioning French military presence, or pushing for full monetary independence, they often found themselves suddenly facing political instability, coups, or economic pressure. Some leaders complied, others were removed. One of the most famous examples of resistance came from Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso in the 1980s. He openly criticized the CFA system, calling it a tool of neo-colonialism. He wanted true economic independence for his country. He dreamed of an Africa free from foreign financial control. In 1987, he was assassinated in a military coup, widely believed to have been backed by French interests. Officially, France denies direct involvement. But in Africa, his death is still remembered as a warning: challenge the money system, and you challenge power itself. Meanwhile, countries using the CFA franc have struggled to industrialize. Because their currency is tied to the euro, it is often too strong compared to neighboring countries that have their own currencies. This makes African exports more expensive and less competitive. So instead of becoming manufacturing hubs, many CFA countries remain stuck as raw material exporters, sending cocoa, oil, gold, and minerals abroad, while importing finished goods at high prices. A classic colonial economic pattern, but wrapped in modern financial language. By the 2000s, pressure against the CFA system began to grow. African activists, economists, and politicians started calling it what it really was: a financial cage. Protests erupted in Senegal, Ivory Coast, and other countries. Young Africans demanded monetary independence. They argued that true freedom was impossible without control over their own money. In 2019, France announced a reform. They said they would end the CFA franc in West Africa and replace it with a new currency called the EC. They also claimed that African countries would no longer be required to store their reserves in France, but many critics were skeptical. They pointed out that France would still maintain influence over the new currency, and that the structural power imbalance remained largely intact. And so we arrive at today. 14 African countries remain tied to a monetary system born in colonial rule. Their wealth flows through Paris before it flows through their own streets. Their economic destiny is still partially shaped by decisions made thousands of miles away. So ask yourself, is this protection or control? Is this partnership or dependency? Because the country that secretly controls Africa's money does not rule with armies anymore. It rules with exchange rates, reserves, and financial agreements that most people never read. The CFA franc is not just a currency. It is a power structure. And like all power structures, it creates winners and losers. On paper, France presents the CFA system as a shield. They argue that it protects African countries from inflation, prevents reckless money printing, and provides stability in an unpredictable world. French officials often say, without us, these economies would collapse. But when you look beneath the surface, a different picture emerges. Let us start with the central question. Who actually benefits? In theory, African countries benefit from monetary stability. But in practice, the biggest beneficiary is France itself. By requiring African countries to store a large portion of their foreign reserves in the French treasury, France effectively gains access to billions of dollars in African wealth. This money does not sit idle. It is invested, circulated, and used within the French financial system. Africa earns. France invests. This gives France immense economic leverage. If an African country ever tries to break away from the CFA system, France can threaten financial consequences, restricted access to reserves, credit, or international markets. In other words, independence exists. As long as you behave. Then there is trade. Because the CFA franc is pegged to the euro, it is often artificially strong. This sounds good, but it is disastrous for development. A strong currency makes exports expensive. So instead of selling processed goods, like chocolate, textiles, or manufactured products, many CFA countries are stuck exporting raw materials like cocoa beans, crude oil, and unrefined minerals. They sell cheap, they buy expensive. This is classic colonial economics, just packaged in modern banking language. Meanwhile, French companies continue to dominate key industries in CFA countries: banking, telecommunications, energy, and infrastructure. Major firms in energy, logistics, ports, and banking profit massively from African markets, while local industries struggle to compete. It is not formal empire. It is corporate empire. Now let us talk about the countries that tried to resist. One of the most powerful examples is Libya under Muammar Gaddafi. Gaddafi proposed a gold-backed African currency, an alternative to the CFA franc and the Western financial system. His goal was to free Africa from European monetary control. In 2011, NATO intervened in Libya. Gaddafi was overthrown and killed. Officially, it was about human rights. Unofficially, many analysts argue that his financial ambitions threatened Western dominance over African resources and money. A coincidence or a pattern? Another example is Cote d'Ivoire under Laurent Gbagbo. Gbagbo openly challenged French influence in his country. He questioned economic policies tied to France and sought greater autonomy. In 2011, he was removed from power after a controversial election backed by French military intervention. He was later arrested and sent to the International Criminal Court. The message was clear: challenge the system, and the system pushes back. But not all African leaders oppose the CFA. Some defend it fiercely. They argue that it prevents corruption, provides credibility, attracts foreign investment, and keeps inflation under control. Leaders in Senegal and Ivory Coast have often stated that abandoning the CFA would cause chaos. But critics argue that this is exactly the logic of dependency. You are told you are too weak to stand on your own. Then came 2019, so-called reform of the CFA. France and several West African leaders announced that the CFA franc would be replaced by a new currency called the EC. They said African countries would no longer need to store reserves in France, the name CFA would disappear, and the system would be more independent. But many economists and activists were unconvinced. Why? Because while the name might change, the structure largely remained the same. France still retained significant influence over the monetary framework. The peg to the euro was expected to continue, and many of the same financial mechanisms stayed in place. Same system. New branding. Meanwhile, outside the CFA zone, other African countries were proving that independence was possible. Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa all have their own currencies. They face challenges, but they control their monetary policy. They can adjust interest rates, print money in crises, and devalue their currency to boost exports. CFA countries cannot do this freely. So the real question becomes, is stability worth sovereignty? Because the CFA franc has kept inflation relatively low, but it has also kept economic growth constrained. Low inflation. Low development. A calm cage is still a cage. Today, a new battle is emerging. China is rapidly expanding across Africa through infrastructure projects, loans, and trade under the Belt and Road Initiative. Unlike France, China does not impose a currency system, but it does create financial dependency through debt. So Africa is now caught between two powers: France with monetary control and China with debt influence. A new form of economic struggle is unfolding, and here is the deeper truth. Africa is not poor. It is resource-rich. Gold, oil, cobalt, diamonds, lithium, cocoa. The continent has immense wealth. The problem is not wealth creation. It is wealth control. Who decides how money flows? Who benefits from it? Who truly holds power? The CFA franc is not just about France. It is a symbol of a larger global system, where former colonial powers still shape the destiny of their former colonies through finance instead of force. The chains are no longer made of iron. They are made of contracts, exchange rates, and bank accounts. So when people ask, which country secretly controls Africa as money, the answer is clear. France does not rule Africa with armies anymore. It rules with money. And that may be even more powerful. But the story is not over. Across West and Central Africa, a new generation is rising. They are educated, connected, and less willing to accept economic dependency. They are asking, why should our reserves sit in Paris? Why should we print our money in France? Why should our currency serve foreign interests more than our own? The battle for Africa's future is no longer fought with guns. It is fought in central banks, international institutions, and economic agreements that most people never see. The question is not whether Africa can be free. It is whether it will choose to be.